So here we are in Ireland in 2025, and we also have Donald Trump's inauguration, which is going ahead later today. So, what I want to do over the next few minutes is have a look at some of the aspects of society that impact people the most. Not all of them, but some of them. I will have a look at a potential role that Donald Trump may have in that, or the American government, right, whichever people are sitting in there may have on Ireland. I will pose a question as to whether that might Donald Trump's inauguration, or not just his inauguration, but the fact that he will be the president of America, what influence that may be having and might have on Ireland, both in the last few weeks and in the coming months and years. So I will be having a look at some of the decisions that Donald Trump made in his previous term as president, and I will be looking at how Ireland may factor into that. So I'd be kind of zooming in and zooming out a little bit, highlighting Ireland and then drawing back to have a look at some of the more global or international activities that are happening that could be affecting us. That will affect us, right? We know it's foolish to say that it doesn't, right? So I will look at first culturally, and I suppose academically, and in terms of the media. One of the most interesting things and impactful things, I believe, in regards to cultivating free thinking, free thought, free sharing of ideas, and open and honest debate around conversations, is the quote unquote end of woke, as some media outlets have put it and have posed the question. So, are we in the era of the end of woke? The reversal of, I suppose, the overlaid value system which people have had blanketed on them by different aspects of society, right? And news talk is one of those, right? So news talk, for those who aren't familiar with it, is, as I suppose, left leaning, they fit the mold perfectly for the whole diversity, equality, inclusion, gender ideology, feminist ideology, pro immigration, pro dilution of national sovereignty, pro anti borders, right? Sort of mentality, right? Where the idea of claiming anything legitimate in terms of Western European or white nation is faux pas, right? It is anathema to progress and liberalism and all those sorts of things, right? So they've been heavy on pushing those sorts of narratives, right? Of not fostering an open and honest conversation around anything related to those topics. Instead, they will brandish arguments that are counter to theirs as morally inferior and of highlighting some sort of moral deficiency in the person who might hold those views, right? So, but they, given their stances, they have come out and they've, as a news agency itself, right, and their own quote unquote journalists, they've been asking the question, are we at the end of woke? And some of them even saying that they would welcome it out of one side of their mouth, while out the other side of their mouth they're still pushing similar things that would fall under the bracket of woke, right? So we're also seeing international withdrawals from diversity, equality, and inclusion initiatives, such as Facebook or Meta. They've stopped their programs, and McDonald's, places like that, have also stopped. And you're seeing it now in some of the Irish newspapers as well, where they're questioning the idea of having these initiatives or programs being run in universities and whether it's a good idea or not, right? So there's a shift of gears, there's a change of direction occurring here, and we will get into potential motivations or potential forces that are deciding on the trajectory of the journey, right, where we're going. And one person in particular, not to be zoning in on people, right, but this person's, I suppose, their ideological journey over the last number of years has been a great case in point of this, right? So it's David McWilliams, who is an economist, and he writes for different newspapers as well, right? And a good number of years ago, I think he was in a documentary, and he was talking about the impact of changing demographics and growth of populations would have on the economy, and whether that is a sustainable thing or not, right? And then he flipped 180, and he would be, I suppose, demeaning the idea, or pouring scorn on the idea that rising immigration levels into Ireland would have anything to do with crime, or would have anything to do with an effect on the supply and demand of services, housing, etc. And now he's lately again done a 180, so he's returned back to where he began. And he's now questioning, or opposing, I suppose, the idea that immigration does have an effect on tension, on services, on the pressures that everyday people experience in society, right? And this, for an economist to even struggle with that idea, it shows one of two things, perhaps, and a number of others too. So either he doesn't understand the field which he has made a living from, which is economics, simple supply and demand, right? So when demand is higher, supply has to meet that, or people go without, right? So simple principles. So for him to go against that over the last few years would either say that he is tick, as Irish people would say, simply put, he's either tick or he's skinning the game, right? So he's benefiting out of it. But either way, he's after doing a 180 to land back to where he began a number of years ago. And the benefit of that then is that these questions are becoming more mainstream, right? So the everyday Joe would have been screaming this from the rooftops over the last number of years, right? That constantly bringing in new people into Ireland is going to drain the resources. It's going to hoover up the supply of services in Ireland, right? And it's going to impact on native people negatively, right? Longer waiting lists, all that sort of stuff. So after years of these conversations or arguments, legitimate as they are, being ridiculed and considered as racist, they are now being brought back into the mainstream without the moniker of far right, or without the scorn being poured on it, right? So they're being legitimized, which is good. You know, as much open and honest debate as you can get is great, right? And this comes at a time where Ireland, I wouldn't even say we've elected a new government, but we've elected who we have elected. Questions about legitimacy of voting and the transparency around the mechanisms of voting in Ireland aside, we have who we have at the moment, and we have a number of independents, people who are not affiliated with, officially anyway, who are not affiliated with political parties, getting into positions of power and being the glue that forms a new government, right? So you have essentially three parties: Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and groups of independents, or just independents being independent, right? And we have some people who would, on the surface, perhaps not in their voting histories, right, but on the surface they would have been considered as going against the progress or the liberal project, right? So they've been put in there now, and they have some checkered histories as well of corruption and lining their own pockets, so to speak, right? But what an interesting thing is, we have seen, so these independents, they added their seats to the government to allow Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to hold a sufficient amount of seats in the government to be able to form a government, right? They needed the independent numbers, right? Otherwise they'd have to go and look at other political parties which they might say they're not aligned to. But interestingly enough now, so these new independents, they're after been given the ability to straddle the fence on both sides, right? So have a leg on either side of the fence. So they're, while officially they're in support of the government, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, they now have the ability to, and this is not a new thing, right? This just hasn't been acted, right? But they now have the ability to take up speaking time in the Dáil in opposition to the government, right? So it's a fascinating series of potentials could come from that, right? So you could either see independents walk lockstep with everything Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael do and say, in which time they would merely be wasting other opposition parties or candidates or TDs. They would be hoovering up and wasting their time to, I suppose, pose questions or to challenge the government in the Dáil, or they might actually be in a strong position to hold the government in check on certain issues. It just depends on the moral fibre of these people, or which tail will be wagging the dog, so to speak, right? So there's some interesting potentials there, and all will be revealed, right? So how do we explain such a uniform U-turn, an ideological U-turn, right? So we have BlackRock, who are one of the biggest movers of finance around the world, and finance leads to influence, right? And influence leads to power, and power is decision making, and you have control then, okay? So they have pulled back on some of these things as well, right? The DEI sort of stuff. So they've kind of pulled back on that, and climate initiatives, all them kinds of things, which all fall under the similar political umbrella, right? So they've withdrawn their support for that, which means that nearly all companies who they are invested in, which is many companies and businesses, right? They're going to fall in line too, right? So what are the influences in this? Could it be Donald Trump? And if so, then what does this influence really look like? Is it just a desire to be seen to be not being antagonistic to his views, or is it more of an exerted power or influence where he might be forcing or compelling them to move in certain ways, right? So in order to try and understand that, if we take what Trump has said over the years, we will recall that he's continuously claimed that, quote, we have it all, right? And he said this in one instance on November 25th, 2020, following the election. He claimed that we have it all. And the timing of this instance could naturally lead one to assume that he was speaking about evidence of voter fraud, which is something that he claimed occurred. But if we pull it back and look at it, put the name and the personality of Donald Trump aside, because it very little to do with him, but principles before personalities, right? Or potentials before personalities. So you can get sidelined into talking about a person, and you can miss the moves that are being made, right? Underneath the surface, or just behind the facade of it, right? Behind the persona. So if we pull it back and pull the scope back, we can understand that Donald Trump, being the fact that he was the president of America, and he is again, he would have high level clearance and an ability to declassify intelligence reports which could hold incriminating evidence over many people involved in politics, business, intelligence agencies, finance, and other, if not all, influential areas of civilization. And not just in America, okay, but internationally. As all American presidents do indeed, right? They may not have ultimate clearance, but they would have sufficient enough clearance to be able to understand what goes on behind the scenes, right? Whose hands are in the cookie jar. And have we got any evidence to support this then? Well, we do, right? So we can have a look at, the media loves the things that Donald Trump says, right? They love it. It gets hits, it gets it creates revenue, and it allows them to whip people into an emotional frenzy around this, right? But if we look at the things that he did, it kind of opens up other avenues of conversation. And one of those avenues are the executive orders that each president is entitled to claim, right? Entitled to write and make, without having to go through the burden of the decision-making powers in the government, right? They can write executive orders, which is, I'm making sure this thing happens, right? Essentially. And some of the ones, each president writes loads of them, right? Individual decisions. And Donald Trump has a couple of them that we're going to look at here. And one of them is Executive Order 13818. And it is blocking the property of persons involved in serious human rights abuse or corruption. And the purpose of this order was signed on 20th of December 2017. And it was to implement a global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. And what does that mean, right? So individuals can face asset freezes, visa bans, and other financial restrictions. And it also means that they cannot conduct business or own property in the US if they're found to have been involved in serious human rights abuse or corruption, okay? And this is global. This isn't just specific to America, right? So he signed it in as a global Human Rights Accountability Act, which is interesting. And it aims at imposing sanctions on individuals for human rights abuses or corruption globally. Right. So, what is he thinking? What did he see that would encourage him or spur him on to write such a thing, right? To cast a net over the globe, essentially. So, what does it allow for? It allows for the blocking of property and interests in property for any foreign person determined by the Secretary of the Treasury to be responsible for or complicit in serious human rights abuse or corruption. This includes asset seizure and sanctions on individuals listed in an annex, which covers a range of global figures accused of such activities. The second executive order that we'll look at is related to enforcing federal law with respect to transnational criminal organizations and preventing international trafficking, right? So this is something that flew under the radar for many people because it is hard to argue against this, right? So one of the things that Donald Trump said, I believe it was in maybe 2015, but certainly 2016, was that he would be cracking down on people smuggling, human trafficking, international smuggling and trafficking of children, slavery essentially, and the abuse of not just children but humans too, right? So signed on February the 9th, 2017, this order addresses transnational criminal organizations involved in various crimes including human trafficking, drug trafficking, corruption, cybercrime, and financial crimes like money laundering. So if you couple the two of those together, he has created the ability to seize assets of any and all people who are involved directly or indirectly in any of these crimes: human trafficking, drug trafficking, corruption, cybercrime, and financial crimes like money laundering. How many people are on the hook for those things, do you think? So, how does Ireland fare in regard to these issues? We'll cycle through a few kind of headlines just to give you a taste, as if you needed it, right, of what is bubbling in the pot in Ireland, right, socially and nationally. So Ireland has continuously received one of the lower ratings for effectiveness in addressing and combating human trafficking in Europe. This is continuous. It is not just the case in 2010, for example, that it was pointed out and we fixed the problems. No, continuously, year after year, Ireland has been given one of the worst ratings in Europe. And in Western Europe, it has the worst rating for dealing with human trafficking. What does this lead to? Naturally, if the penalties are not severe or if they're barely investigated for any crime, you're going to get more of that crime, right? So if all of a sudden in the morning you didn't have to pay, you weren't going to get prosecuted if you pulled up, filled your tank with diesel or petrol and drove away. You wouldn't get prosecuted for it. Do you think you would see more people fill their tanks and just roll away down the road? You would, of course, right? Human nature. So this will lead to obviously more human trafficking cases because Ireland will be seen as a soft spot. And the 2024 Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, which is published by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, found that figures on human trafficking victims are a considerable underestimate of the true number in Ireland and globally, right? We have also seen instances in Ireland of not just human trafficking, but human trafficking for organ harvesting. So people who are being channeled or trafficked into Ireland with the purpose of taking them people's organs. It's a handful of cases that have been revealed or found anyway. But again, just one is enough because it shows that these things can and do happen, right? Because that's where we're at the moment, where people would have the knee-jerk response to this sort of topic being brought up, and they say, Jesus, that doesn't happen in Ireland. There's no one brought here getting their kidneys taken, right? But we know that it does happen, so it can happen. And how much of that is happening, well, we can't really be sure, right? So if you've 10 cases of it happening, that have been found, you can be sure there's probably at least 11, right? So the UN then is platforming, this is from the Irish Examiner, is platforming some alarming facts that 1 in 3 victims of human trafficking is a child. Children are more likely to be subjected to violence than older victims. The trafficking of girls is predominantly for sexual exploitation, right? So remember that as well, that UN is saying that 1 in 3 victims of human trafficking is a child. This will lead us then to Ireland and quote unquote the new category of unaccompanied minors, which are children who end up in Ireland from God knows where, from all corners of Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and other areas in the world. They have somehow, being children, ended up swimming, running, cycling, but finding their way the whole way to Ireland, across at least 2 seas, right? By themselves, apparently. And in the last 5 years, between 2019 and 2024, nearly 600 unaccompanied children have arrived at Dublin Airport seeking asylum. So in 2022, 262 minors arrived unaccompanied, and in 2023, 197 arrived. So from 2019 to 2021, there were 94 underage arrivals seeking asylum. These add up to around 1,372, nearly 1,400 unaccompanied minors over the last, heading towards 10 years, right? And in 2017, 175 of these children were referred to TUSLA. In 2022, TUSLA received 597, about 600 referrals of unaccompanied minors, with 261 being said to have come from Ukraine alone. And all in all, then, 45 unaccompanied minors have gone missing in Ireland since 2017 and remain unaccounted for. So they're gone. They've not been found, right? Naturally, look, some kids go missing and they're found 4 hours later, but it goes down as a missing child case, right? But you have 45 kids who vanished, got to Ireland and disappeared. Are they still here? Who knows? Are they gone? Are they alive? Are they dead even? We don't know, right? Because we don't know where they are. So 45 children have come to Ireland since 2017 and vanished, with a focus on the period from 2021 to 2024. There's a specific mention of 29 minors missing, right? So since 2017 overall, this that we know of, 45 children have just vanished since they've come to Ireland. So a lot of these unaccompanied minors, you would imagine most of them would end up in the care of the state, because who's going to be claiming these children? For those who don't end up being referred to TUSLA, which is like the organization or the branch of the government, semi-branch of the government, which is involved in the overseeing of child protection in Ireland. Okay, so a percentage of these are referred to Tusla when they get here. I would question where the other children, where do the other children go? Who's claiming them? Where do they go? Do they have relatives here? In which case, how are they ending up marching across Europe the whole way to Ireland on their own? Right? Is that even possible? Surely it's possible, but is that reasonable to assume that that's what's happening for 600 of these kids, right? Or are they being trafficked here? Because this leads to an instance and an incident, right, where one child who came here, a 14-year-old girl from Africa, was said to be trafficked to Ireland, right, and she was placed in state care under Tusla. Apparently, within 30 minutes of entering state care, she was abducted by a gang. Naturally, this would lead you to believe that the gang had prior knowledge of her placement and her movements, right, where she would be. I find it hard to believe they just happened upon her within hours of falling under the care of the state. She just vanishes, right? She's just abducted. So what does this suggest, right? Because all these things pose questions, right? And it'd be nice to have the answers, but we don't. That's why we ask the questions, right? So are there dodgy social workers who are giving out information? Are there corrupt social care workers who are giving out this information? What's going on here? Are there Gardaí that are involved in this sort of a thing that are giving out this information? Okay, and you'll remember as well that a few years ago we had the HSE hacking, right? So there was apparently cyber attacks on the HSE, which it's great for plausible deniability if there are corrupt elements involved in this sort of thing, because instead of it looking like you have people on the inside releasing this information, now you can go with your hands clean and claim, oh, it was obviously the cyber attack, people got the information that way, right? But be that as it may, this 14-year-old girl was kidnapped after landing in Ireland and in the care of the state, and over a year later she was found locked in a brothel in Limerick, having been forced to work as a slave, right, and being abused and exploited. And what does this tell us, right? So this case is highlighted in highlights the vulnerability of unaccompanied minors in state care, kids just wandering into Ireland with no adult relatives that we know of, right? And last year, 17 out of 38 minors who went missing from state care in the first 9 months of the year were unaccounted for. Okay, so they're disappearing. There's children coming to Ireland. A lot of them are ending up in the care of the state, and they're disappearing. They're not being found again. And we have one example where one child ends up working, right, being forced to live in a brothel, exist in a brothel, and be abused by any and all that came that way. So again, back to the idea of shattering the illusions that Irish people live under. These things can and do and are happening in this country. Okay, so moving on from child trafficking, we also have the drug trade in Ireland, which has come to be heavily dominated not just by some Irish gangs, which is a problem in and of itself that needs to be eradicated, but we also have the importation of slaves, notably from Lithuania in Eastern Europe, where people are promised a steady income and a job when they come over here, and once they arrive, then their passports are stolen and they are being badly abused and beaten, and they're forced to work in the drug trade and most likely become drug addicts themselves, right? If not being forced to become drug addicts, because that does happen. People will be forcibly injected over a prolonged period of time with certain drugs to make them dependent on it. The only place of getting these drugs then is the very people who are after kidnapping you, essentially, right? So this is going on here. But flip side and silver linings, there also are big projects and operations that are continuously undergoing, right? And every now and again, some of the results will bubble to the surface, and we get to hear about them, of these cartels or gangs being attacked and being arrested, right? And we see cases of this. So recently we've had, in the last month, 5 charged with conspiracy to import drugs in Kerry, I believe. So what else have we got here? So as far back as 2011, this is from the Irish Examiner, they stated that the peoples, or the groups of people, or the countries from which groups have come to Ireland who are most heavily involved in human trafficking are the Roma people, Romanians and Nigerians. They're cited as the most involved in human trafficking. That is 14 years ago. Is that still the case, or have there been other groups and gangs added to it? Of course, right. And in 2020, the heads of these gangs, these were Lithuanian gangs who are importing heroin into the country. There's 2 of them. 2 of the heads of these gangs evaded capture as they were out of the country at the time. How was that information known in order for it to be revealed at the time? Was it given to Gardaí, or when some lower tiered people were arrested, did they give up that information, or were these people known to the Gardaí already? Could they have been tipped off so that they weren't there when these raids and arrests were made? Who knows? Who knows? And yeah, so this is from the Journal, and it says, quote, over the last decade, a violent H gang, right, brown stuff gang, has been plying its trade around Ireland. It uses human trafficked teenagers to do its bidding. It also ordered an acid attack on a Garda who was investigating it. Young women have been forced into the sex trade because of it, yet it has operated below the radar for a long time thanks to the Kinahan and Hutch feud, which is fascinating, right? So you see this in some segments of the internet where people, and perhaps on both sides of the question as well, or the issue, you'll have people who are concerned about the immigration, and they'll throw up all crimes related to immigration, right? And then on the other side, you'll have people who want to shut that down, so they'll just promote the crimes that are committed by Irish people. And you tend to see that with the Kinahan gang. They tend to absorb most of the headlines, while you have case after case after case of people not from this country who are coming here, building up their own gang and crime networks, and not making the country a better place, right, so to speak, or to put it mildly. So ultimately, we have very little idea of who's coming here, and this is emphasised, I suppose, indirectly by Roderick O'Gorman, who was the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. What a title, right? When he stated in 2022 that 40% of people who applied for international protection in Ireland did so without identification. So they've come here when we've no idea who they are, or even where they're coming from. We just have to take their word for it. And then from an American government perspective, we have, regarding human trafficking and the official numbers, government sources, this is about Ireland as well, right? In America, claim that a comprehensive 2021 study found that from 2014 to 2009, the true number of trafficking victims was likely 38% higher than official national statistics. And this article, they were talking about, again, the terrible record that Ireland has in combating these sorts of things. And they make recommendations as to what Ireland should do or could do. So, if one were to be involved in this sort of carry on, this sort of evil, then Ireland would naturally be seen easily as a safe haven, as over the course of 14 years, there have only been 3 convictions for such cases, human trafficking. despite there being over 1,200 related offences being put before the courts. I will say that again. So in the last 14 years, 1,200 offences related to human trafficking have been brought before the courts. And there, out of those 1,200 offences, there have only been 3 convictions. Again, that's just emphasising the horrendous record that Ireland has in challenging this sort of thing. So, how deep does this sort of thing go, or how high up does it go? Interestingly enough, in 2024, last year, we had a former Dublin politician, Bill Tormey, or Tormey, Tormey, and he was charged with human trafficking and possession of child abuse material. So we've had someone who has been, and look, as is the case with Ireland, as with most places too, but notably with smaller countries where people, it's easier for your sphere of influence to be spread over a wider area of the country, right? And it's easier in Ireland to have more influence over the nation than it is in Brazil, right, or India. I know it's a continent, or America, whatever the case is. So we had this guy. He was in, and he's no fool either. Like, or he's not a nobody, right? So he served as a Fine Gael councillor on the Dublin City Council from 2004 to 2014. So 10 years in power, right? So what sort of connections did he make prior to being in power and being in power? What favours did he curry? What dirt does he know, right? So who does he know is at what? And this guy has been charged with the trafficking of an illegal immigrant into the country and child abuse material. So what's he after saying? Who's he after giving up? Because these things don't happen in isolation, right? So in order for him to have possession of these sorts of things, he got it from somewhere, which implies the involvement of someone else, directly or indirectly. These people don't operate in vacuums. They simply can't. Okay. Same with the drug world. You can't have somebody bringing in drugs or being in possession of drugs without somebody else being related to that crime too. So who's he after giving up? Who does he know? And that's just, I suppose, a secondary point really. But the main point about it is that, again, in Ireland, have to highlight this, these things can happen, do happen, and will continue to happen. So politicians involved in human trafficking into Ireland, great, we have that now, right? And moving on then from public representatives to public servants, i.e. people involved in the guards. In 2023, there was a reported case of corruption where a guard allegedly ran a cash for visas scam with a Pakistani fixer. This operation allowed up to 800 largely Pakistani nationals to enter Ireland illegally since 2017. The scam apparently involved accepting bribes of up to €10,000 to stamp visas, enabling the illegal immigrants to stay in Ireland. That's just one instance. It's just one instance. And what is a potential bomb waiting to go off, maybe literally and figuratively, with this sort of thing, where you have at least 800 Pakistani nationals who are coming here, breaking the law to get in here, right? So they're coming in as criminals, right? And if you're willing to break the law in one area by bribing a guard, no less, what's your threshold in regards to other crimes? Very, very low, right? So this is a dangerous situation. And why this should be highlighted by probably everybody as well is the effects that we have not yet learned of, right? So Helen McEntee, our Justice Minister, our former Justice Minister, our Minister for Justice, stated that over 80% of asylum claims, this is last year, in Ireland are made by individuals who have entered from the UK, right? Either directly or indirectly through Northern Ireland. So you see a lot of this, people who are clearly of African descent or Middle Eastern descent, and they're claiming, or they're being portrayed as refugees coming here for safety, but they've English accents, right? So what is going on here? Why are they fleeing England? England is relatively safe in comparison to, I suppose, their own homelands, maybe, right? But probably not too much different than some of the bigger cities in Ireland, right? So to flee England to come to Ireland doesn't make sense in terms of direct safety from conflicts, etc. It does, however, make sense when we are speaking of fleeing for the sake of getting away from the place you're in, right? So these people might be wanted over there, which would show specifically in the idea of bribing to get their visa stamped, right? So they're not willing to show themselves officially coming in here based on their own merit and based on how pristine their reputation and their criminal history is. They're not willing to try and get to Ireland on the basis of that. They don't want to be known when they're coming in here, which tells you that they're probably fleeing because they're criminals and they've committed horrible acts in England, right? What could those acts be? I think we're seeing that come to the surface now with the grooming gangs in England, which has been going on for decades, and a lot of them are largely, again, Pakistani Muslims. Okay, so are we importing people who are fleeing after committing those crimes over there? Most likely. Again, we don't know. And this is from the Dublin Inquirer and from 2015. It speaks of the applications by Pakistani asylum seekers to Ireland having jumped 8-fold so far this year. Massive increase, right? Massive increase. Not only that, if we go back to another minister, Roderick O'Gorman, again, he's in charge, of the integration, immigration, all that sort of stuff. I-pass refugees, the whole scandal, right, if you will. And one example of this was a hotel in Swords, an example of deceptive practices, we'll call it, right? So murky actions being taken and murky decisions being made, to put it mildly. So there was a hotel in Dublin that was found to be offered for emergency accommodation without proper documentation proving ownership of suitability. So somebody put forward the hotel and for the housing of these people and also for the payment involved in this, and they weren't even the legal owner, so that the contract had to be cancelled, right? So how could you get so close to it that you could pretend to own a hotel and pretend the contract was signed? I would imagine if they had to cancel it, right, or it was close enough to being signed, and you have someone pretending to own a hotel and on the back of that being very, very close to taking millions and millions of your money from Roderick O'Gorman and his department. And he responded to the criticisms, naturally, of these sorts of things by emphasizing the usual. Mistakes were made, we need to get better oversight so we can stop these things from happening in the future. But no one really did anything wrong. These things just happen, right? And I will stay in my job because sure, wasn't my fault. This sort of thing. Another case then at these little emergency care settings or companies or homes that are being set up, a lot of them by people of African descent, right, which Roderick O'Gorman has been funding. And in one instance, there's a care provider that was accused of using fake vetting for staff, right? So pretending that they were given a clear Garda vetting report when they couldn't have been, because they were fraudulent. The person wasn't vetted at all. So the same thing, yeah, with the emergency accommodation thing as with the childcare. These organisations being set up, being pumped full of millions and millions of euros of your money, and deceptive practices being involved in it. Okay, this leads us again at Roderick O'Gorman to the Child Law Project, and from 2012 until its funding was not renewed last year, 2024, the Child Law Project compiled regular reports on court proceedings highlighting issues within the child care system. So Roderick O'Gorman decided essentially that this wasn't going to be going ahead again. There would be no, this project would not, because it's being discontinued, there's very little oversight in terms of court proceedings and court decisions being made on children in care and how they're being dealt with in the courts, right? And most notably, again, these unaccompanied minors. So they are absolutely going to fall through the cracks and disappear, probably at a higher clip and a higher rate than has previously been the case, because there's no, the project that was there to oversee these decisions, it's gone. He decided not to fund it anymore. And one judge expressed grave concern over the cessation of the funding. The judge noted the project's role in exposing Tusla's failings. Right, so you have a bit of oversight there. So are terrible decisions being made? What are the procedural failings on the parts of Tusla and the state, essentially the government? So we won't get to hear that anymore, because that oversight is now being destroyed, because the government, or the project, is not being funded by the government anymore. Shocking. So the government is not going to fund the very watchdog that is going to point out some of the failings of the government. Surprise, surprise, right? And naturally, look, you have some politicians that some will want to score points by pointing out the nonsense of this, and some will be legitimately concerned, right? But either way, they've turned the security cameras off just before they rob your pockets, right? What does that tell you? And another area of concern in Ireland is the abduction of children, right, or the attempted abduction. And it's hard to get a number on these things, but if you've been on, I suppose, social media, you'll see every now and again there'll be people putting up warnings of someone trying to grab their child, or someone actually grabbing their child, right? And there was one instance in 2024 where there was a child taken. The person was arrested and charged, right? And the guards had asked the judge not to allow for the revealing of the person's name due to the political and the current political climate in Ireland, right? So based on political tensions in Ireland and social tensions in Ireland, the Gardaí had asked the judge not to reveal the person's identity, right? That's a political decision. You can call it what you want, but you should allow people to have as natural a reaction to any given situation as possible, you know? So just withholding information like that, it ends up creating the very situation these people claim they're trying to stop from happening, right? Another thing then that highlights Ireland's failings in terms of human trafficking is the national referral mechanism, right? Where you can assess people as they come in, basically, and determine whether they might be victims of human trafficking or not, right? And Ireland's governments have been dragging their heels on this, and they've also been dragging their heels on something that has gone through all right. But there was delays with it. Is the criminal law, the Sexual Offences and Human Trafficking Bill of 2023. Right, so Ireland has been highlighted as being deeply inefficient in getting these things up and running. Another layer of the society, or you call it the state if you wish, because that is who these people serve, because that is who pay them, is one example is the Judge Martin Nolan, right? If you look at his cases, not all of them, because you only get some of them, right? So one's related to sexual offences. You can see that the sentences that are being given to some people involved in these acts are laughable. Some of them are being given suspended sentences. Some of them who are involved in politics or TUSLA or any of these kind of organisations or agencies who have been caught with child abuse material have been given the most lenient of sentences, while you have people like Enoch Burke, who spends well over a year in jail for contempt of court. You know, he didn't even break a law, he was just in there because of contempt of court. So again, when you have a judge who is wielding their authority and wielding and influencing the scales of justice in such a strange and odd fashion, their whole character has to be called. Their mental capacity for the job that they're in needs to be called into question. And if that seems to be the case, that they're perfectly cognizant of what they're doing, then their morality needs to be questioned, along with their hard drives, right? Add to that, then the idea was floated recently that prisons are overflowing, right? So the idea or the suggestion was made that releasing sex offenders early would allow for the freeing up of space in the prisons, right? Because it was cited that the recidivism rate is lower than other crimes, right? I think that is a terrible way of evaluating it. The recidivism rate should not be how you gauge that. It should be the impact of those crimes if they are committed again on people. And I would much rather someone who's a pickpocket be released than someone who is an abuser of people, right? But this is the world we're in. And look, Irish people, we tend to look at these things and claim everything as being down to stupidity, right? On the one hand, we are a mentally distorted people. We do not see things clearly, purposefully so, I would add, right? But we are an irrational people, collectively, right? And if it doesn't apply to you, it doesn't apply to you. But collectively, from the outside looking in, you would judge us as being a deeply irrational people, and we should be okay with saying that. And we've seen snippets of those who are employed by the state or closely aligned with it, engaging in corruption and criminality, or again, innocent until proven guilty. They're being charged with it at least. But what if that is simply the tip of an iceberg? Logic would demand that this be the case, otherwise we would have to claim total trust in the Gardaí and the government's ability to track down and eradicate all crime and corruption in the country. This is just not feasible, nor is it probably possible, right? So what if there are deeper laid connections between the state and the levels of criminality which we see on our streets and across the land? For Irish people, we have a tendency to judge those with less influence in society, and drug addicts being probably the best example. Petty criminality seems to be where most of Irish scorn is laid, whereas we tend to excuse or accept the criminality and abuse of power by those who actually hold more power and influence than we perceive ourselves, whether in reality or not, to hold, right? So we excuse those above us and we condemn those below us. That is the Irish tendency. And according to the German philosopher Hegel, this serves to place us in a position, or I would imagine that, given Hegel's ideas, that this serves to place us in a position of moral masters over those slavish drug addicts and welfare recipients, right? So Hegel had the understanding or the idea of master-slave dynamic, which unfolds between people, even in momentary conversations, right? That's the dynamic at play until you overcome that. And we all engage in that with people, whether we're honest about it or not, right? We assess where we are on the totem pole in all interactions we make. So it also reflects the Irish tendency to excuse abuse from above and to accept it. It also reflects the Irish tendency to excuse abuse from above and to accept it as criminal, on a par with or beyond that of the petty criminal, would be to place us in a position of the slave, being abused with no retaliatory ability, right? So, in order for us, or if we were to assess political corruption or favour currying as criminal, in the same way we assess drug addicts or whatever the case is as criminal, then that would be to relegate us to a position we don't want to be in, which is in the slave dynamic. We're on the slave side of the master slave dynamic there. People don't like to put themselves there, right? We also like this. We always like to scapegoat and place others beneath us because then we're on top. And people do not like to see themselves as such, as a slave. Irish people most definitely not. And this placement would shoulder us with the moral burden to overcome. So if we were to accept the fact that we are in the dynamic with those above us, we are in a slave position, then the burden, we would have to accept also the burden of overcoming that position, neutralizing that position, putting ourselves on an equal footing, earning that equal footing, combating criminality from above, right? Because we tend to take the position that if those we see as beneath us would simply get up and get on with it, then all will be well. We scapegoat, as our know-it-all attitude would never allow us to claim that all is well in the political sphere of morality, right? So we naturally, I would imagine every Irish person, if you ask them, are politicians corrupt? They would all say, yeah, of course they are. But we refuse to see that as criminal or as morally wrong, which places us as a race cemented in cognitive dissonance, where we hold two contradictory attitudes simultaneously. We are irrational collectively, as I said. So what I mean by that is we will pour scorn on, right, petty criminals, right, welfare cheats, that kind of thing, and we will declare them the worst of the worst. But when we look at politicians and governments who create a situation and an environment that puts our lives at risk, and they also claim the power, they exercise the power, but they claim the authority to steal as much money from your pocket as they want, and there's nothing you can do about that. We don't have the same sort of scorn for that. We accept that willingly, right? But we also then accept, on the other hand, that these people that do that are corrupt. So our minds are fractured. We don't know what we're doing here, right? We don't know where to turn, we don't know where to fight. So we spit on those we see as beneath us because we can get away with it, right? We don't rock the boat too much by questioning authority because we're cowardly as people in this age, which is a sad thing to say, but that is where we are. But be that as it may, what if those who we view as above us were actually in part, or at least, far more criminal than we would ever care to admit? And what if these elements have been caught in the crosshairs of justice, right? So this is full circle here. For we claim that nothing ever changes, and it's a sentiment which suggests a belief that those in power evade justice due to the power they wield and who they know, right? So we claim them almost in totality as corrupt, therefore criminal. And we claim that nothing ever changes, right? The same old thing, same old sing song. That implies the fact that these people get away with it because they're corrupt, right? They get away with their corruption because of their corruption, because of who they know and the favours that they can curry. However, this soft corruption and influence, or outright blackmail, can be used to keep culprits free from justice, but it also can, if in the right hands, be used to whitemail those whose hands are dirty, right? So we blackmail, which is getting someone to do something underhanded, immoral, or illegal. But we also have whitemail, which you rarely hear, but having dirt on someone, you can force them to do something that is right, right? So what if this is part of the explanation for the U-turns we are now seeing in Ireland? because fundamentally we are all posed with the question of whether we accept that all those with power and influence are malignant, or whether there can be honourable people who can hold and use power with more moral purity than others. And this is where we now sit as a nation. And some of this will be revealed over the coming months, and the more truth that is pulled from the shadows, the better. So best of luck with the year. Make it what you can, and be as good as you can in your own nature, right?